Hello, everybody. I hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to the Crispy Talk Show. My name is Marcy. I am the founder of Lisanga Vibes, and you're going to have an amazing time with us tonight. Just so we can see that everything is working, can I just ask those who are connected to start saying hello in the comment section so we can see everything works well because we want the conversation to be very interactive with everybody. So for those of you who are already live, I highly invite you to be as free as you want in the comments. This is a discussion for everybody, and we hope that you will enjoy it tonight. So, welcome everybody. Hi, Camille Network team. Hope everything is well. So, my name is Marcy. I am the founder of Lisanga Vibes. Lisanga Vibes is a safe space for the African diaspora. We curate events, podcasts, a talk show online, and we also have a website that will be live very soon where you will be all able to access our blog and all the content that we curate in both French and English. For those who do not know us, this is how it looks like for those who have had the chance to attend our events prior to lockdown. And yes, this is just part of the fun. So, as I said, it's a safe space for the African diaspora. And we organize events. This was last year, our anniversary party. And we also want everybody to be invited to the second anniversary party as well. So please pay attention because we will be dropping a lot of information for you to make sure that you know when the next one is coming. For tonight, the discussion is centered around Africa Liberation Day, what it means, where it comes from, and to try and understand and reflect back compared to our time on what it means and how we in the diaspora on the continent connect to it annually. I have an amazing panel with me as well tonight. So I'm going to briefly remove the presentation just so that I can introduce them. And then we're going to come back and I'm going to let them explain and tell you what they do in more depth. So I am going to welcome first someone that I have had the chance to meet in real life and to interview as well. His name is Professor Hakim Adi. He is absolutely knowledgeable and incredible. He was the first professor of history of African descent in the continent. He's been active for a long time. He wrote so many books that I'm just going to show you the covers because I can't read all the titles. But he's also involved in the project Historians Project, where he encourages people between 16 and 25 to engage more with their history and produce creative content around that. He is also a professor of the African. Let me just take my notes so that I don't give you the incorrect information. He is professor of the history of Africa and the African diaspora at the University of Chichester. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Hakim Adi. Hello, how are
Hello to
you?
you. Great to be here. I loved your music as well. The introductory music was
Thank you so much. I'm happy that it pleased you. How are you
definitely did.
feeling?
I'm pretty good. A little bit tired, but I'm good. It's a beautiful day today.
I know the weather is amazing, so I'm really happy that you still managed to stay committed and to be with us because it's so easy to say
Always,
the weather is nice. I think I've got other plans, especially
always
in the
committed.
UK. All right. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I'll introduce our second panelist for tonight. So she's also amazing. I've not yet had the chance to meet her personally, but I'm really, really looking forward to it. And it was such a great connection from all of this time during lockdown that I've made last year. Her name is Apeike Umolu. And she is an historian and the founder of the African History Project. It's just a page and a website that produces extraordinarily good content. I've attended several of their lectures, so I can testify. And I know that they also have workshops. There's also the African Review, I believe, that's launched recently online, but I'm not going to tell you too much so they can both expand on what they want to tell you about their profile and their project. So, Apeike, welcome. You're on mute, so we can't hear you.
Hello.
How are you doing? Welcome.
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I mean, this is our second conversation of the week, so this is
Yes,
so
it's
blessed.
true. Yes, yes, yes. It's very true. We were online on Tuesday. We are also celebrating Africa Liberation Day and also commemorating the life of George Floyd and unfortunately his murder and what happened over the last 12 months following that. So that was a very, very interesting discussion. If you want to see more of that, go to their Instagram page. That's where the IG live recording is. And you'll be able to just have a feel of all the other amazing organizations that were invited to that discussion. So I'm going to put back the presentation so that Professor Hakim can probably briefly tell us who he is. We're listening.
More briefly than you explained who I was?
Oh, I leave it to you. Just tell us.
Well, as you said, I'm a historian of Africa and the African diaspora. I was trained in African history, but a lot of my work deals with the history of the diaspora, or history of Africa and the diaspora, I would say. You can see some of the things that I'm interested in, particularly political history. As you said, I'm also one of the founders and the consultant historian of the Young Historians Project, which is a project for young people to encourage them to engage with history, young people of African or Caribbean heritage, to engage with history. They do some amazing work at the moment. They have a project focusing on the history of African women in Britain, particularly on African women in a health service throughout the 20th century, which is nearly coming to completion. I'm also involved with History Matters, which was established about 6 years ago, focusing on the underrepresentation of people of African and Caribbean heritage in the history profession, we could say, as historians, history teachers, and so on. We have a journal also called History Matters, which is online that people can access, which focuses on particularly on the history of African and Caribbean people in Britain. We have a conference coming up in October on that subject. What else? I'm currently working on a book on the history of African and Caribbean people in Britain, to be published by Penguin. That should be out hopefully this time next year when I've written it.
Right.
And what else? I don't know what else. I run a very important master's program in the history of Africa and the African diaspora, completely online.
Right.
So if you want a master's degree on having done some research, whether you're in Africa, the Caribbean, the US, Hong Kong, we have a student from Hong Kong, wherever you are in the world, you can join at that degree. It's to encourage people to become historians.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just on the history side. I won't go into the other things, but those are the legal things.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Thank you so much for being with us tonight and for agreeing to share with you some of your expertise and research done over several decades.
You're welcome.
We are going to move on to the second panelist. Apeike, do you want to share with us what your project is about?
Yeah, so the African History Project really came out of, I think, well, I'm in education, so I'm an educator anyway, but with a deep passion in history. So my background is originally in law.
Right.
And I came to history a bit later on and was very, very kind of passionate about having this platform where we can share history, but you can study as well. So the African History Project is actually a school. So it's a school of all aspects of Black history. And we have a public lecture series. So we have a lecture every month, a free lecture. But we also have, as you said, a series of workshops, short courses, and full year-long foundation certificates that you can follow us with as well. And we're very excited. We just welcomed today our first summer fellows and also our next cohort of researchers. So it's also a place that if you're interested in practicing history as well, we really welcome people to come into the institution and help it to grow.
Absolutely. I just love what you guys do as well. And I've really, really enjoyed. I think I attended 2 or 3 of your lectures, and it was just amazing the amount of information that I've learned on West Africa. I think I attended one on Ghana, I attended one on Steve Biko, and it was really, really good for that reason. I apologize if you hear a dog barking. My neighbor has a dog, so that is not mine. So apologies if that is in the background somehow. Okay, so I'm going to remove now this presentation so we can kick off with the discussion. So basically, I wanted to have an exchange with you both around what Africa Liberation Day means and where it comes from, and then try and see in our current time how we connect with it, whether it's still relevant, whether it is still a moment in the year where we can think of all the struggles that we currently still have and how we can address them, and just compare basically at the time Africa Liberation Day started, how the situation was, and today how the situation is for us. So the first angle of the discussion that I want to tackle will be around politics and around understanding where it came from, what it was about. So I have done my research, but I am sure that Professor Hakim will be able to add on and probably complement what I will share with the audience. So from my research, I understand that Africa Liberation Day on the 25th of May started in 1963. However, there have been prior dates and prior celebrations to that. And one of them that I found is called Africa Freedom Day. And I think it dates back to 1958, and kind of the link with the all conferences organized in Ghana by Kwame Nkrumah. So if it's incorrect, please, Professor Hakim or Apeike, just please add in and let us know so we can really understand how it all started. Who wants to take that one first?
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. That sounds about right to me. I don't want to contradict you unnecessarily.
Yeah, that's what my understanding is as well. That it is to commemorate that meeting of African leaders and the signing of the first document that brought them all together to think about ways to work more concretely together from 1963 onwards.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, African Freedom Day was originally established at the First Conference of Independent African States in Accra in 1958, in April 1958. So African Freedom Day was celebrated in April originally. I think it was first held in this country in the following year, 59. All kind of people were involved. I think Claudia Jones was involved. I think Paul Robeson was involved actually in that celebration, and others. And it was held throughout that period. It was particularly celebrated by a committee of African organizations and others that were formed around that time and grew out of developments in Ghana in that period. And then, yeah, African Liberation Day was celebrated from 1963 onwards, the founding of the OAU, May the 25th. And again, was celebrated here. I mean, when I was young, it was a bit, it was a big deal. There were lots of big events, more than one sort of national event. Well, there used to be demonstrations. I remember one in London, in Brixton. That would have been 76 or 77. So anyway, they were big celebrations. They used to include in Britain all the major liberation organizations. Obviously, at that time, the armed struggle was in flow. So you would have organizations like, ANC, PAC, MPLA, Frelimo, others, whoever they were, maybe EPLF and others, wherever, Polisario. Those who were in struggle on the continent would generally come and speak, as well as from other parts of the world. So yeah, important event. And then somebody decided, well, Africa didn't need liberating anymore, so we could drop the liberation. Isn't that wonderful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm happy that you're already bringing up this point, because that's going to come up later on as well in the discussion as to all of the evolutions of the name, and probably also how the people identified with what it originally meant. So I guess as you already alluded to it a couple of times, you said OAU, but not necessarily everybody listening knows what the OAU is. So if you could just share with us quickly what it is and how it was then transformed into the African Union as well.
Yeah, the OAU is the initials, the acronym for Organization of African Unity, which was established in Addis Ababa in 1963. And it was the Organization of African States. So all the independent African states at that time came together to form the OAU. It's generally considered that it was a kind of compromise organization, shall we say, because there were different conceptions of what kind of organization, what kind of African unity was required. And there were some, most notably Kwame Nkrumah, who had the notion of a United States of Africa, a union of African states. And then there were others who wanted a kind of more loose organization, shall we say. And so the OAU was what was created. It is probably its main success. It was, amongst other things, dedicated to the liberation of Africa from, particularly from settler colonialism, as it used to be referred to. And probably one of its most, one of its achievements, you could say, was to the extent to which it was able to organize to bring that about. So establishing an Africa Liberation Committee, assisting those who were struggling for liberation in Angola, Mozambique, and other places. So that was successful. However, it was also kind of discredited in general because it was a collection of dubious individuals, generally speaking, and it had all kinds of limitations, which I won't go into now. And so, in the period at the end of the 20th century, there was and with some changes in Africa and developments that were taking place on the continent, particularly probably the influence of South Africa and also the influence of Libya, of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, there was a thinking that there needed to be a new organization which was better suited for the challenges facing Africa at that time, at the turn of the millennium. And so there were plans developed to found a new organization, which essentially what became the African Union, which initially was established with the orientation that it was going to be a bulwark, as they said at the time, against neoliberal globalization and various other things said at the time. And I'm sure some people were serious in that orientation. But when it was formed, it kind of took on a different character, shall we say, and to what we have today. Anyway, and with various characteristics. I mean, one of the first things it adopted was NEPAD, New Partnership on Africa's Development, which was allegedly a partnership between African countries and those countries that were largely responsible for oppressing them. So it was like a partnership between the lions and the lambs. So anyway, that was its character. One of its other significant features was that it included the sixth region. Essentially, the entire African diaspora was designated the sixth region, and in theory at least can participate in the deliberations of the AU. And then there was one country that had special status, that was Haiti, because of its historic significance and so on. So anyway, so the new organization of African states with the diaspora included is known as the African Union.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this great presentation and just helping us to see as well the evolution of the struggle and maybe the goals that were the aspirations of those two institutions before they converted it. So, Apeike, I know that the OAU transformed into the African Union in 2002. But as we look at it currently in terms of what it does, etc., and I'm going to be very specific for you. So regardless of what those watching or you in the panel think of what the African Union is and represents and so on, I'm still going to use that as a basis for our discussion so it can help us to branch out in the other directions. So I'm going to refer to the Agenda 2063. And just to ask you, what are your thoughts on that program, for example? Because I know that for those who don't know what it's about, so we've just said that the Africa Liberation Day started in 1963 in its new form. And the Agenda 2063 is kind of a way of saying within 100 years' time, we're going to try and achieve and go further. But we still use that as a reference point. And I understand that it's a framework of initiatives and goals that have been determined by the African Union that have to be implemented before 2063 to move further the continent. So I'm not going to go into all the details of how it's organized exactly, but I just want to have your thoughts, Apeike, on this Agenda 2063. What do you think about it? Have you heard about it? Is it something that you really refer to, or?
Well, no. I have to say that, as I said to you, as you probably know, my area of kind of interest is more 19th century and early 20th century history. So this particular area, looking at the African Union, I come at it not necessarily as a historian, but as an African myself. So as a Nigerian myself, and as a member of the diaspora. So that particular, device, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but from what you're saying, I can kind of imagine what it is. Maybe something along the lines of sort of the Millennium Development Goals that we had out of the United Nations. So if I think about it in that sense, I think that we have to ask ourselves, why do we have such mechanisms? And the first thing is to draw attention to particular issues in our society and to raise awareness for those particular issues. And in that way, these sorts of devices can be highly effective in making sure that policy design is geared towards meeting the needs that a whole group of people have determined is what the continent needs. But when I look at things such as the Millennium Development Goals, those were quite successful. But then there's been, for example, the current iteration of them is this idea of the Decade of Africa. So we're currently in it. I don't know if you knew.
Correct. No, thank you for highlighting that as well, because it's very true. I think it ends in 2024.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, the first one was extremely successful. In fact, I think that many people continued their the initiatives that they started under the Millennium Development Goals. They continued that. This one, we can all hypothesize why. Many countries actually went to the extent of stating that they were not going to recognize this decade, including the United Kingdom, which is quite a slap in the face, given the big part that it has played in the lives or in shaping Africa itself, and also this sixth region, the African diaspora. It exported more people than anyone else, of course, from the continent. And then in relation to the African diaspora, it continues to receive so much of the diaspora as well. So I think that you can have these sorts of mechanisms that work from a marketing point of view or a highlighting point of view, allowing people to focus on what the continent needs. But you do need to have uptake, and it needs to be something that speaks to the actual people that are going to implement these plans as well. So in terms of the specific plans, whatever they are, I'm not sure exactly what they are. I'm not sure if you know what they are.
I'm going to try to be impartial in this moderation, to not show too much what I actually think of some of these questions or some of these institutions that we're going to refer to. But it is true that the African Union has basically set it up in, I think there's like 7 aspirations subdivided into 20 goals, and then each goal has several priorities. So that's kind of how they organized it. And then within the 2063 agenda, they then chunk it into 10-year blocks where they try to achieve things within the 10-year period. So I think we're currently finishing probably the first of that initiative to go to 2063, and then there'll be another one. But as you said, sometimes it is a bit difficult to understand where they're trying to go with some of these initiatives. So I don't want to jump in too much into the questions that I prepared for the diaspora part, but there will be some questions that I have for you in terms of trying to understand whether those institutions really bring in change, or are they just there to issue reports and then raise like the year of these, the day of that, and so on? Because sometimes that's how it seems. But I'm not going to jump into that point so far. I think the second point I also wanted to talk about in this discussion is the aspect of trade. So one of the aspects that is quite interesting when you look at what the African Union has done recently is the African Continental Free Trade Area. So I understand that that agreement was founded in 2018, so it's not that long ago, but it's coming into effect this year. So it's supposed to have started from January this year. I'm not sure how you two are well aware of that project or not, and if you want to just share with us. Yeah,
I do
sure.
know a bit more about that one because I take quite an interest in ECOWAS, being from West Africa. So kind of, thinking about how those two organizations and ideas will work. And I understand there are various levels of ratification and signing, and, not everyone is really at the same place with it. My deep interest in it is looking at the fallout from some of these trading blocks elsewhere in the world and trying to learn lessons from that in terms of going into this. And of course, here in the UK, the big one has been the relationship between the United Kingdom and with the EU. And one of the things, looking back, if we go back into the 70s, thinking about the difficulties that the British economy was having kind of post World War II, and the reluctance of European countries to welcome the UK in because their economy was so bad. I mean, literally the UK had to beg to get into the Union. And then we fast forward a couple of generations, and now you have a retreat from it. I think, and that's because the UK is in an economic position to do it. It would be one of the things that I would be concerned about this is that all the countries are at such different economic levels. And it's important in the drafting and also in the implementation to think about things such as the free movement of people and how that's, we already see some of the things that have been happening in South Africa over the last kind of 10, 15 years, where there really has been the sort of what we would now call it, violence between different people of different nations. And we don't want to see more of that, because when you have a Nigeria alongside, Somalia, for example, competing, it's kind of apples and oranges. So I hope that they can look at the European situation and learn some lessons for the practicalities of things such as free movement and setting of various whatever kind of economic markers they're going to set. I think also as well, it's important to think, even looking at the situation in the agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and the ease with which, a single president could come in and really compromise that agreement and force a renegotiation. And it may have been the best thing for his population, I don't know, but with a continent of that size, and with people at different levels of political maturity as well, or nations at different levels of political maturity, I hope something in the drafting really thinks about the ability of people to pull out, what the repercussions of that would be, what the sanctions of that would be, because once you take people in to such a big block with so many disparities, you don't want to have a situation where what we haven't had really in Africa is international warfare of the likes of Europe of up until 1950 something, or 1945.
It's very interesting what you're saying, especially the fact that you emphasize the size of the continent, because I think we're talking about, I think now it's 1.3 billion people in Africa. And there's also the fact that, as you said, there's disparity between the different countries where they are economically speaking. And I also wanted you both to actually share your thoughts on Ghana. Is Ghana one of the countries that is the most leading in terms of economic strategies to develop the continent and to be an international level player? What are your thoughts on that? Because there's Amazon. There are rumors that Amazon will be going there. Twitter's recently announced that they are going to settle their head office in Accra for Africa. So does it mean that there's really something happening in Ghana?
I think that I think all these economic questions have to be looked at from the point of view of the majority, because otherwise you kind of get lost and don't see the wood for the trees. If we go back to 1945, which I always like to start from, because we had a very important Congress held in Britain in that year with many of the leading Pan-Africanists in the world present, people like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, George Padmore, and others. And at that time, they had a kind of view as to what kind of economy they didn't want and what kind of economy they did want. And the kind of economy they didn't want was what they'd experienced for the last 300 or 400 years, and particularly under colonial rule, which was an economy which was dominated by the imperialist system of states, by the big powers, one in which a few countries benefited, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, and the majority of people in Africa didn't benefit at all. So they said, we don't want that kind of economic system. We want a different kind of economic system, one in which the people, the workers and the farmers play the central role, and is, essentially for the benefit of the people. So here we are, whatever we are, 70-something years later, and that hasn't happened. We still have economies in Africa which are dominated by the imperialist system of states, and the big powers, Britain included, rob them of all kinds of things, whether it's human resources or natural resources or whatever it is. So then when we talk about economic questions in Africa, we have to bear some of these things in mind, otherwise we get lost. So if we talk about like what's the biggest or what's the best, okay, so what are the biggest economies? The biggest economies are Nigeria and South Africa. Okay, does that mean everybody in Nigeria and South Africa is happy? Does it mean everybody in Nigeria has electricity and water? Does it mean everybody has a home to live in? Does it mean everybody has a job? Does it mean everyone gets paid every month? No, it doesn't mean that. So the size of the economy is meaningless. The GDP of an economy is meaningless unless we actually look at what is going on in that economy. Is it to the benefit of the people? And who makes the decisions about the economy? So then when we come to the continental questions, who makes the decisions? Who decided that some common market was good for the majority of people in Africa? Did the majority of people in the continent decide? Were they consulted? No. So this is a mechanism of governments. If we look at those governments individually, whose interests do they serve? Do they serve the interests of the majority of people? No, they don't, generally speaking, with maybe one or two exceptions. So when they create a bloc, a common market, as we've heard, it's going to be a common market very much like probably any other, like the European common market. You could say it could be something which would act as a barrier against the worst consequences of neoliberal globalization. But that's what the AU was supposed to be, and the AU hasn't done that. Is it any more likely that an economic bloc will do it? I don't think so, because of all the things that I've mentioned already. So I think that unless we look at what's in the interest of the majority, as I said, I think we get a bit lost as to, what's actually going on. Now, when we come to individual countries, individual growth, yes, one can point to various countries that seem to be doing well. So yeah, people say, yeah, well, Ghana was the fastest growing economy. Now people point to Rwanda, or they point to Cote d'Ivoire. A few years ago, people looked at Ethiopia and said Ethiopia was the fastest growing economy. So why don't we discuss that? What were the differences? What was going on in these different countries? What kind of development was going on? Okay, Ghana's got oil, so maybe that's had something to do with its growth. But Nigeria has oil. Does that mean everything's fine in Nigeria? No, it doesn't mean that. So we have to look at these things, I think, in a more all-round way, as I say, what is in the interest of the majority. One thing that was very interesting about Ethiopia's economy from the 1990s, maybe for the next 15 years, it had very, very high growth rates for about 15 years. And it started from a very low base. So what kind of development was that? If you look at Ethiopia, it had some quite interesting developments: infrastructure, roads, transport, all the things to actually develop an economy. And other very interesting things about developing of agriculture and some things which other countries don't do. So, and why was that? Well, again, we might have to look at Ethiopia's history and see why it was very different to other countries and so on. So I think these things take a bit more analyzing, but I always come back to 1945. Have we got economies in Africa that benefit the majority? No, we haven't. So to me, the key goal for whatever it is, how many years' time, 40 years' time, is will we have economies in the benefit for the benefit of the majority? If we won't, then who's bothered? Who's bothered about some goals or some scheme? It's not going to benefit the majority of people.
I think thank you so much for everything you said. I always like listening to you because it's like a private history lesson each time. And I take as much as I can in anything you say, even when you say, oh, we're going off topic, it's always great. So I appreciate that very much. And I just wanted to point out to one of the statistics I shared with the audience while you were speaking. So it's very true when you say, is it good for the majority? Because when you really look at it, Africa's internal trade relations only represents 18% of its activities. But when you look at Europe and Asia, with the same statistics, in Europe, it's 59%, I believe, and in Asia, it's 69%. So that really shows what you've just explained. Is it really benefiting the majority internally? Is it really elevating everyone's living conditions? It's not that obvious. And I also want to hear from you as well, Apeike, because I know that we've not emphasized that in your bio, but you also have a background in corporate and in negotiating in project finance particularly, and working in that area as well. So I would like to have your views on this question of the African trade, free trade agreement, and whether you think it will really bring change to the continent, and also your thoughts on Ghana and whether it really the best economical example so far.
Yeah, I'd like to start with what you actually said when you mentioned Amazon and Twitter. And I would take the issue at that level, the fact that we are still looking for these corporations, for these markers of Western success to come into our economies, and it's only their arrival that is an indication of our success, is something we have to ask ourselves. You know, how much are we still within, as I think, Du Bois might say, our double consciousness, where we're still looking to judge ourselves based on whether or not the bully likes us, right? And when we even look then at beyond that and begin to have questions and begin to have conversations about like Professor Addy said, when we start to think about other things that are important to the African consciousness beyond economic value, when we start to think about things such as happiness, then those two organizations that you've mentioned are probably some of the biggest purveyors of unhappiness, if we were to measure it. Twitter, with its last kind of, the last kind of 4 years, what it put us through by being a platform particularly for our community, for material that has really been hurtful, but it made money. And the same thing with Amazon. I like Amazon. I use Amazon, but at the same time, there have been concerns about how they treat their employees, particularly over lockdown. They have actively in the US fought against unionization in parts of their network. They have huge tax, issues or lack thereof because they don't pay.
Yes,
So I'm not sure if we continue along the path of judging ourselves by these criteria, then, and I find it quite ironic that actually Ghana now is being lauded because of I think it's its openness to foreign investment. That's really what you're seeing. And that is a function of the culture of the people, right? The people are, or the environment is, there's a lot of security, the people are welcoming, the people are open. And that has a lot to do with the history of the nature of colonization. It's coastal, the coastal, part that was the Gold Coast, unified almost, if we say, quite early on, and was, they were supporters of colonialism or the presence of the British for a very long time. And there was a kind of territorial unity there that didn't exist, of course, for example, in Nigeria, where you had the eastern and western region along the coast. And then you had Lagos as well. So you had it was kind of sort of split, and then you had the Cameroons split into four. So Ghana is unique because it has a unique colonial history, so unique relationship with colonization and with the colonial power. But it also produced one of the most radical political thinkers, right? And he definitely probably wouldn't. He was, in terms of the original, if we're talking about the OAU, that original bloc, he was part of the radicals. Ghana was a radical, member of the, was a member of the radicals. They didn't want anything short of a United States of Africa, and they wanted to systematically remove all colonial interference in the land. So there's an irony there as well. So 2 points. One, I think we need to look at what it says about us, that we continue to use these European standards to
measure our growth.
Yeah. And secondly, about the fact that Ghana itself has, gone through a transformation. But I think in terms of focusing on Ghana, I actually spoke with a young man yesterday who started an outsourcing company based in Ghana that we're now going to contract with. And he was talking about what's actually happening on the ground. Wow. Which is that, in some of the areas that he's originally, he's Ghanaian, but he grew up in the UK. In some of the areas that when him and his wife were going to relocate back to Ghana, they thought they could live in, they now can't live in. And there are some streets that they went to look at properties on, and there were no Ghanaians on those streets. All of the houses belonged to Europeans. And they have driven up the prices. I mean, the same thing that happens in many parts of the world, driven up the prices. They have holiday homes. There's nothing wrong with these things, but we also have to understand that some of this, growth that you're seeing is a cosmopolitan and almost international growth. How much of that money is going to stay within the country? Let's wait and see, right? How much of that is actually going to breed indigenous commitment to building up? How many of those people are going to go back and begin to do the capital investment that Ghana needs, such as beginning to patronize schools and, patronize community centers and all of those sorts of things, if you're just there for your holiday home and you happen to have a local restaurant as well and things like that. So he was very frustrated because he had gone on a business trip to other countries that are maybe less desirable in West Africa. And he saw that their business leaders were a lot more bullish. Were not going to, he just felt there was a different corporate culture necessarily in those places. And he was worried for Ghana. He really was worried for Ghana that it was going to end up in a situation where, that it might be on paper really successful. South Africa was under apartheid, really successful, right? And even till today, but that means nothing, It means nothing for the original for indigenous people. In terms of looking at corporate finance and things like that, and development, yeah, I think, I'm actually a proponent of what the Gulf economies have done, because that's where most of my career was based as a lawyer, was in project finance, based out of the Gulf, that looked at large scale infrastructure projects in the Middle East and in Africa. And so I lived in that society, and almost my entire family lives out in the Middle East as well. So one of the things that I, noted about that society, it's very small indigenous populations, a very big immigrant population. So it does not compare to Africa in any way. So I'm not doing a comparative analysis here, but there were certain things. The first thing was a deep, deep, deep commitment to making sure that they protected land and that they reserved certain positions for their people. So there's a very acknowledged two-tier of citizenship or two-tier of residency in those societies. You will never be a native. You, as a foreign person in that place, you collect your salary. You will never own land fully. Even if they have little enclaves, within like almost mini Vatican cities around Dubai, own property, you can't really. And so that type of development, working within those spaces and seeing the artificiality of some of the financial systems that were created to bring in foreign investment, but to protect the people, I thought was, something that obviously as a Nigerian, when you see the levels of corruption and the problems, I think, what? So you can actually have people who are going to do the infrastructure projects, it gets done, and there's just this kind of blanket, we're not going to be exploited. And marry that with a very, very aggressive education of their population. There is no bar to what they're pumping into educating their citizens. And then a very aggressive indigenization program that has is now kind of been going for maybe like a decade, where they're actively putting their own people into senior management and actively phasing out Europeans and Asians from senior management. So when I looked at those, and that this was a lot, looking at that and even understanding how their ability to do that came out of the way that they positioned themselves under colonialism, but also out of their spirit, right? Because they have a particular way of working, which was, when one of them, which was Abu Dhabi, became wealthy, that leader, that sheikh, Zayed, understood that everybody else around him had to also be wealthy. Otherwise, he was going to have very real problems, right? So he shared out the wealth. He shared out the oil, the revenues and everything, to ensure that all of the Emirates came up together so that you wouldn't have the disparities that I was speaking about before. That takes a different kind. They're a capitalist society, but it's a different mentality.
The mindset is very, very different. I think it's very interesting what you're saying, because there's a strong emphasis on protecting the real assets, on protecting everything that has a high value for their people. And that also connects with what Professor Hakim just said before. Is it really benefiting the majority? Not really. And yet it seems that everybody says Africa is the richest continent. We've got all the resources. We've got the youngest population. I think the statistics are crazy. Like 60% of the population is like less than 25 years. It's just crazy. When you look at that 1.3 billion, 60% less, it's just crazy. And like, you look at the median age, the population is very young. I think the median age is like 19 or not even 20 years old. So we've got all of these people who are there, who could work, who could produce for their continent, but yet somehow we still have those blockages that you're talking about. And thank you so much for bringing up the example of how the Middle Eastern societies work, because they make that work for them.
Only the Gulf.
The Gulf. Yeah, but they make that work for them. And then you see them in the Selfridges, in the Galeries Lafayette, doing their shopping and elevating their community. So it's not perfect societies, of course.
You see some people in Selfridges.
So that's what I'm saying. It's not perfect society. It's not the majority.
I think again, to my mind, you see lots of Nigerians in Selfridges. Does that mean Nigeria is a successful economy? No, it doesn't mean that. So I don't think we can judge economies by how many people shop in Selfridges or how many rich people there are. There are lots of rich people in Nigeria. There are lots of rich people in South Africa. There are lots of rich people in Britain. That doesn't mean that these are societies that work. And as I said, when going back to 1945, why did those who met in 1945 come to the conclusion that they came to? It was out of their own experience and hundreds of years' experience, which essentially was that capitalism is not good for Africa. And it doesn't matter how much you try and paint it in different colors or put things on it and make it look pretty. It doesn't work for Africa, and it never will work for Africa. So I think that if we go down that road of how to make it look pretty, or can it be prettier, then we're doing a kind of disservice to the vast majority of people in Africa who will never benefit from that system. Never, it's not possible. And we've heard for how many years? 20 years about that things will trickle down. And where have they trickled down? They haven't trickled down anywhere. Yeah. These are myths. They're fairy tales that are told by the rich and powerful to lull people to sleep. And it's not true. These things will never work in our interests or in the interests of the majority. And one of the characteristics of all these societies is that the majority of people have no say in them at all. Whether it's in the Gulf, whether it's in Nigeria or South Africa or Britain or the US, the majority of people have no decision-making powers. So inequality in terms of decision-making means also inequality in terms of benefiting from the wealth which is produced. And we have to remember that in all of these countries, the wealth of these countries is produced by the majority of people. Those who benefit in terms of wealth don't do anything. The millionaires and billionaires in Nigeria, they don't do anything. They don't produce anything. They don't construct anything. Other people do that work. But the other people, the millions of people who do that work, don't benefit from what they produce. It's a bit like slavery.
So, Professor
Hakim, that is something which has to be addressed. And as I say, it wasn't addressed in the anti-colonial struggles that took place sufficiently, or in some places not at all. It has to be addressed now. Otherwise, what we see today will go on. It will continue. There'll be no fundamental change.
And I totally agree with what you just said. I always play a devil's advocate in this show, so that's purposeful because I want to bring out the sometimes what I think through my guests. so that's also intentional. But I want to switch to the next angle of that discussion around society, and you've just started going through in that direction, and the fact that overall the majority is still not benefiting from the wealth of the continent. And I would like to switch our focus on social media. And you're talking about how can we change this? And if we don't do anything, it's not going to change in 10 years from now or 40 years from now. And I want to talk about social media. We've talked earlier about Twitter and how those applications just make part of our lives now, and how all of that is now being used to kind of like raise awareness. But do we really think that those tools are really helping to pursue the struggle, the fighting against those struggles and those tangible political and structural issues? Do we really see social media being one of the potential ways in which we could change the narrative? What are your thoughts?
Well, look, people organized politically when there was no social media. There was no mobile phone. There was no telephone. There was no whatever. There was no modern technology. People organized. You know, the Africans who were in Saint Domingue 200 years ago, they didn't have Twitter. They didn't have WhatsApp. They didn't have mobile phones. They didn't have any of these things. But they managed to organize themselves and become the decision makers, take control of the society, completely transform it. So, of course, all these things are tools. You know, you can use drums, you can use social media, you can use books, you can use pamphlets, you can use telephones, you can use all these things are tools. But the key thing is that human beings have to be organized. It's not a question of, okay, somebody can sit around on Twitter and make a few tweets and this is going to change. People have to be organized and organized, on the ground where they are and so on. And of course, people may use WhatsApp or whatever to do that, but they have to be organized. And there are lots of other things that have to be taken into account to change things, because it's always a very difficult thing to do. It's a kind of life and death situation, and people, it's what needs to be done, but people have to have, what's important is the organizing, the consciousness, the thinking, the how to do this, who are the most important people to organize, how to organize them, what's actually going on in particular countries that needs to be developed politically and so on, and how do we learn the lessons from previous history and previous struggles and so on. So there are lots of things that need to be done and lots of different tools and weapons that can be used, of which, social media may be one. And people love to say, okay, there was this rebellion or this uprising or this struggle and it was all done on Twitter, all done on WhatsApp, or all done on Facebook. Well, maybe, I doubt it. But just as in the past, people might have said, well, it's newspaper, or it's this, or it's this, it's this. But they're all tools that can be used. But the key tool are human beings and human consciousness of what is required, how to organize, and not just from the point of view necessarily of getting rid of the old. That is definitely an issue. But what about the new? What is the new? What kind of new is required? Because unless you have a conception also of the new, then you tend to veer back towards the old, as we've seen so much in, you say, okay, as Nkrumah did, seek ye first the political kingdom. Well, whose political kingdom are you going to seek? Because if you just seek the political kingdom of those you want to get rid of, then you're going to end up with the same problem. So that new political kingdom, whose political kingdom will it be? What will it look like? Who will make the decisions?
So many interesting points. So I really, really appreciate all of your contributions, really. Apeike, I would also like to hear from you on this point and how social media can or cannot sometimes help us to continue fighting against the structural issues and political realities that we're facing.
I definitely agree with the point that it's a tool, because even before there was paper, there was revolution. And then at one point they tried to ban, various governments, regimes around the world from the, proliferation of the printing press, have tried to ban papers if that is what, causes revolutions. And the same way with social media, increasingly there's been a call to regulate it and to, you have countries countries where you can't even get certain services because it's seen to be subversive. For me, social media has two functions, and I see it in two ways. I did not use social media until this business. So I have my core business, which is an actual normal school. I don't use social media at all for that, and kind of reversing, because we've learned so much from this school to apply. So I definitely think you don't need social media. So that I'm not one of those. However, for this particular project, I've had to immerse myself in social media and immerse my team in social media. And there's certain things there's certain beliefs I now have about it. The first thing is social media is I think eventually it's going to come to be seen as a form of real estate in terms of how we deal with it. And it's an opportunity for people to acquire real estate with lower barriers to entry than if we actually wanted to get physical pieces of property. If I wanted to do what I wanted to do in a brick and mortar building, there will be huge barriers to entry, and there will be a lot more scrutiny of what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. I would need to take a huge amount of risk, capital risk. And an institution, a landlord would have to take reputational risk by, having me involved. And there are also limitations, opening times, planning laws, all of this sort of stuff. Now, sometimes, when when Instagram doesn't approve one of my Winnie Mandela posts because her hand is up and it's political, yeah, that's pretty annoying. But, that's, a lot less than, you have to close at 8 o'clock because that's the planning regulations in this place. So I think that social media allows, with a lower barrier to entry, it allows people that otherwise would not have the means to engage in certain type of conversations to carve out for themselves, digital space and digital forums, free as of now, essentially, increasingly monetized, of course, and with inherent problems as well. So that's the first thing that I think that is important about it. It's just allowing maybe a different sort of person to get involved. And I think it's also leading to micro activisms as well. You don't need, before, to really make a change when you didn't have social media or you didn't have a printing press where you really had to go out into the streets and begin to break machinery and things like that. You needed enough people to overcome the physical force of the state. And now you don't need that. We hear of the girl with George Floyd, 365 days ago, who with her camera was able to beam her experience around the world. She didn't need editors and people with, printers to do that. She could do that. So in that way, you can get micro activisms, so more people doing smaller things, and then you look at the whole, which I think Black Lives Matter might fall into that when people come to look at it in 10, 15, 20 years time. The other thing as a Black woman that I think that social media has done is really to begin to, or what it has allowed to be done, is the recalibration of the Black aesthetic. Where before, in order to get the Black image into the media, there were so many gatekeepers with deep problems, institutions with deep problems, individuals with problems. So the main outlets would have been billboards and television screens, adverts, this sort of stuff. These are the places where image was proliferated. And there were humans that said whether or not your image was acceptable. And now that has reduced. And actually, despite the problems that there are on social media, on something like Instagram, if you only follow people that produce a certain type of content, you will only see positive images of yourself. You're not going to on my feed, I only see people that have a positive impression of who I am and what I look like. I am constantly being reminded about myself, the positive things about myself, and that didn't exist before. So I think there is actually now, whereas before perhaps Biko could speak of Black is beautiful, but he couldn't maybe afford to get a billboard all around, billboards all around South Africa and change the packaging of every single, milk carton or something. Now, every time, if you can curate for yourself worlds in which everything that is being sold to you or being pushed at you is in your image. And I'm not saying that's solving the problem, particularly that Black women face, but I think it's a completely different. If you were to try to navigate this world without that, it could, I just think we've moved a lot further when you start to think of the reappropriation of Black hair, the reappropriation of dark skin, all of those things that are coming back to us, and we're championing. So the championing of Black skin, of darker skin and things like that. I think social media has been integral to that because we don't have physical, huge gatekeepers anymore. We can produce our own. So in that way, and that does lead to economic realities, because out of that, you now have entire industries that cater to us, and we're talking about real things, beauty products, hair products. Entire industries come out because they can market to us. Whereas before, you could have an amazing beauty line, but no TV station would take your advert, if you were going to feature Black models. And that has real economic effects. And social media, because of the low barriers to entry, advertising is so small, means that people can begin to market and break down some of these structural difficulties that there were before. So in those two ways, I think it's useful. It doesn't mean it's dangerous.
Interesting. I think for those listening to us, start thinking of your questions. If you have anything that speaks to you, I've seen some people in the comments interacting to what was being discussed. Thank you. Keep being interactive and just raising your points and questions. I think I just have a couple of questions before I open up the floor to your questions. So if you can think of anything overall this discussion that spoke to you the most, or you would like to have more information about, then feel free to put it in the chat so that we can highlight it for the guests to respond. So we've talked of this question of social media, at least giving people lower barriers to entry, to put themselves out and to try and create a space or a voice for themselves. And I want to talk about the fact that it also brings up the question of ownership and cultural appropriation. I think you were just about going in that direction before you closed out your point, but I would like to quickly touch on that because apparently the African Union said that 2021 is the year of arts, culture, and heritage. So, okay, that's one good thing. And I think that over the last 12 months or so, what you've just described about the fact that social media has lower barriers to entry and to access to promoting your message has really been amplified by the fact that we were all on lockdown. And what I have definitely seen from my perspective is a lot of performative activism as well in that sense. So as much as the girl who recorded the murder of George Floyd permitted it to be viral, a lot of people on the back of that have used that as a way of promoting themselves because they understand how the algorithms work, which was not necessarily working in the direction of actually fighting against the problem that was raised by the video. And also the ways just, freely share the pain of Black bodies is just out there, and people are almost now not really sensitive to it anymore because they just see it happening like so frequently. They're not really reacting and responding to it as they should. And I also appreciated what Professor Hakim said earlier about the fact that when people fought in Saint-Domingue, there were no social media, but they still knew that they were fighting for something important for them, and they successfully managed to overthrow the system that was oppressing them. So I want to talk about that question of ownership and how you guys see the discussion going in this Pan-African space. Do we feel that because on the surface apartheid is gone, most of the African countries have had their independence party and so on, even though economically there's still huge issues, that is it not also kind of distracting us from the fact that there's still a lot of serious issues, but because we've seen kind of the big milestones broken down, then the fact that now with social media, the struggle is kind of like diverted to, I want to see more Black people, like Black representation matters, rather than actually like economic empowerment, education that is meaningful, and so on. I would like to have your thoughts on how maybe the kind of activism that we see sometimes online and also on the ground is kind of shifting towards liberal aspects of our life rather than political and economical. So I'm not sure if my question was clear. It was a bit long, but I hope that you guys can share with us some insight.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think one of the things about social media and media in general is that most of it is not our media. When I say our media, I mean the media of the majority. It's the media of the big multinationals, the Facebooks, the WhatsApps, the Twitters, the whatever they're called. They use these things for their purposes, and the state probably monitors these things for their purposes. So although they're their tools that might be used like anything else. They have their dangers and their limitations, and I think that's extremely important to bear in mind. I think that as far as everything else goes, the struggles, we used to say the struggle continues. Wherever you look, people are in struggle. Wherever you look on the continent, wherever you look in the diaspora, and we've seen that obviously with Black Lives Matter and so on over the last year and so. People are in struggle. They want an alternative. They want change. They want something different. They don't accept what is at the current, because it's something which oppresses them. It disempowers them. It doesn't give them anything. So that quest for something new and how to get it is, like the key question which confronts everybody. Even if it relates to COVID, if it relates to racism, if it relates to employment, these are the key questions. And sometimes they manifest themselves in different ways that we think that, we think, for example, we think that racism is the key question. Racism isn't the key question, really, but it's a consequence of the key questions. Right? So anyway, sometimes it's a diversion from the key questions. But anyway, these are things that are, kind of life and death questions, and people are grappling with how to deal with them, how to solve these problems. And we mentioned Saint-Domingue, and one doesn't want to go back too many years, but it's a very, very interesting struggle of Africans, which was successful. And you could say that there are not many struggles of that kind which have been successful, especially of people enslaved in that way. Whereas the anti-colonial struggles have, had some measure of success, but haven't been seen through to the end for various reasons, many of them political. So learning what the limitations of those struggles were, however radical these guys were, the Nkrumahs, the Mandelas, the Amilcar Cabrals, the others, they haven't brought the liberation that people sought. But people are still oppressed. People are still without homes. People are still without jobs. People are still without electricity, still without water, still without all of these kinds of things. So the revolution in Saint-Domingue is very, very interesting because they didn't have mobile phones. They didn't have cars. They didn't have these things. They spoke different languages. What language did they even speak to wage this revolution? What language did they use? Because they all spoke different languages. How did they communicate? How did they sustain this armed struggle for whatever it was, 13, 14 years? How did they defeat the three principal armies of the world at that time and liberate themselves? What was their thought material, their revolutionary ideas that sustained them? These are things that maybe we don't think about enough, and maybe we should think about them more. How did they come to that thinking where they could conceive the first modern definition of human rights? They did all these things. and yet we kind of pass over it, maybe as if doesn't have that significance, but it does have that significance. They didn't say, okay, well, what our problem is that whatever, the way that we're imagined, the way we're presented isn't good enough, or there's not enough. Anyway, they weren't diverted by kind of minor things. They understood what was the key question. The key question was that they empowered themselves in order that they could make decisions about everything. The kind of economy, the kind of society, the kind of whatever. So to me, that's, in different conditions in the 21st century, those are the kinds of questions that to me confront everybody. Why is it that in South Africa people fought for 50 years, went through all kinds of torture, death, deprivation, had the whole continent behind them, had the whole world behind them. And yet, in South Africa today, people are still living in, townships with almost nothing. People are impoverished. People are all these things. These are important questions to think about, because I think they then inform how we think about what are the key things confronting the continent, as well as the diaspora, because in the diaspora also people have made many sacrifices over many years, along with many others. But what are the key things that need to be done to transform things? Look, we live in a country, or happen to be in a country, it's one of the richest of the world, and yet it struggles. It even struggles to deal with COVID, let alone to deal with all the other things, education and all the things that people need, health and so on. What is it that we need to do so that we can live in a society where everybody can have what they need to exist? The wealth is there to do all these things, just as the wealth is there in Nigeria to do all these things, and South Africa to do all these things, but they're not being done.
Is still very, very wide open, and it still seems that we have still a lot to do, even though it may seem as we are more comfortable depending on where we are living on the planet. But the issues are still there, from what I understand from what you're saying.
Yeah, I don't think most people are very comfortable. Some people might be comfortable in some countries. Most people, most Africans on the continent are not comfortable. Most people, even in Britain, are not that comfortable. They're probably more comfortable than most people in Africa. But again, our conception of what we need to be comfortable, we need a good health service, a good education system, good pensions, good all these things, which we don't have, which are not guaranteed. Whereas in Africa, maybe people want to know, am I going to have electricity today? Yeah. Am I going to have clean water today? Am I going to get paid at the end of the month today? Yeah. They're more basic questions. And even those basic questions have not been solved. Why is that? And what needs to be done to make sure those basic things are solved?
It's a deep question, but I will not let you continue so that you can save some for the Q&A session. However, I would like to hear from you, Apeike, on this question of ownership, of how potentially we can kind of, maybe I'm not sure if divert is the correct word in this context, but because for most people, it seems that the biggest struggle have been done, even though it's not correct. I know Professor Hakim would absolutely disagree with that, but let's say on an average level of people who are not initiated or not necessarily concerned on a daily basis with those issues, it may seem to them like, what are we fighting for? What are we claiming this Africa Liberation Day every year on? Like, what is there left to do? So what are your thoughts on maybe the liberalization of some of those struggles?
Who are these people who think that?
Young people, I'm not going to bring in the generation gap in the discussion, but I think that I'm going to give you an example, for example. When I went to celebrate last Africa Liberation Day, I think it was probably 2 or 3 years ago, I can't remember which organization, Pan-African organization in London it was, but I definitely remember that we were in an amphitheater and I could see around me, there were not many people my generation. So it was kind of all like people from the same kind of age range being very aware and very already like starting from a high political point of view compared to us. So when I look at things as like my generation and most of the generation of the population living in Africa being young themselves as well, if we can't have those that political grounding, that political understanding of those issues, how can we effectively take part? So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this question, because if you look at how social media was used over the last 12 months to pursue those fights, it was very performative. So if you don't have the political grounding to understand what police brutality is, and that it forms part of a bigger system that oppresses people in many different ways, you may think that because you shared that post, that's enough. You've done your part, and that's kind of why I want you guys to expand on that. But anyways, I've said too much. I want to hear about you, Apeike, and your thoughts on kind of this liberalization of the struggles.
I think firstly, on the kind of picking up on what the professor said, I think we as a community have to firstly, we have to really understand what the UK, and that's where we are. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And when a lot of people come even to my organization and say they want to get to a certain point, and they kind of say, I want to get to this certain point. When I get to this level of clarity or understanding, I'll feel like I know something. And they asked me where they should start. And I said, you should start with British history. And they're like, what? You mean I shouldn't start with, slavery? I shouldn't start with colonization. I shouldn't start with the Ashanti or, I said, no, I think you need to just study the society that has brought you to this position where you think that you have all of these problems, right? Because when you study British society, you will understand that it is a history of exploitation. And the number one group that they've exploited are their own people. And that exploitation continues, as the professor said, to this very day. There have always been, the majority of people in this country have always been exploited. And we have to be able to think about where's the end goal that we want to get to. If the end goal we want to get to is this kind of utopia where everybody is, is economically sound, then we can't use the tools of people who their own society doesn't exhibit that. This society doesn't exhibit the equality or the, that we want to see in Africa. There are people who, going to food banks in the United Kingdom. In the US, there are people, they have a homelessness problem that is extreme. So particularly on the West Coast of the United States. So I think that when you study British history, you will realize that this kind of communitarianism that Africans are seeing actually did not come from the state, but came from the charitable sector. It didn't come from corporates. It didn't come from people being wealthier. It came from the middle classes, the rise of the middle classes, the increased interest in social justice in the 19th century. And that there's still a lot of people that are left behind. So I think that's the first thing we have to do, is understand that the societies we're modeling ourselves on are still in many ways impoverished. Just definitely relatively, because they shouldn't be poor. There shouldn't be poor people in this country. But also as well, like we spoke about before, when it comes to happiness, spiritually as well, there are deficits spiritually that we have to think about. The rise in religious adherence, or the breakdowns of family or disconnections from families, things that for Africans we haven't gotten necessarily to that level of disconnection. So that's the first thing. I think we also have to understand that the nationalism project of the 19th and 20th centuries were not just fighting colonialism, but they were also fighting the indigenous form of government as well. They wanted to take away power from indigenous rulers who ruled autocratically and form these states that didn't need to rely on ethnic characteristics in order to survive. So one of the promises of nationalism was that there would be a fundamental redistribution of assets and a fundamental rethink of how we govern ourselves. The unfortunate thing is, for whatever reason, the indigenous elite were replaced with an intellectual elite, of eventually taken over by a military elite, and increasingly now it's all going back to an economic elite or financial elite, and we're just getting back to a normal kind of Marxist structured society, and that's it. So I think we have to think about both British history and colonial history together, and understand that nationalism itself was not necessarily in support of indigenous African ways of doing things. It also wanted to get rid of some of the indigenous ways we do things. In terms of your point about, now going to your actual question, was about activism. I think to an extent, all activism is performative, right?
Yeah.
Because it has to get attention.
Yeah.
And people who go out on the streets are always going to be the minority of the people who actually care. So, for you, it's kind of like if you have a bad experience, you're more likely to leave a review than if you have a good experience, right?
Right.
The same thing with activism, that, if you see one activist on the street, there's probably 10 people behind that didn't say anything, but you have the same message, right? We do need people to be performative. I don't think that I don't think it's a bad thing that some people had black squares and now they don't have black squares, because it indicates to me that if one person had a black square, there were probably 10 people who wanted to have one. And, and maybe by seeing one, somebody might begin to think more about their behavior. So there is, I think, value to it, even if it is not necessarily concrete or immediate. There, how does a zeitgeist get built up? How does it develop if you don't have the people at the fringes or the extremes going to the next level? And we have to really think about who we're willing to leave behind if we're going to use capitalist tools, because capitalist tools require that we leave some people behind. You cannot want everyone to be doing well, and at the same time you're using, as you said, the Amazons and your Twitters to gauge your success, because these are institutions that are deeply capitalist, and by definition, something like Amazon is trying to leave people behind. It's trying to leave entrepreneurs behind. It wants to break down independent booksellers and, or force them to use their platform the way that Uber forced smaller minicab companies to, eventually close up, and everybody went on to Uber because there was no competition. You had to. So I don't have a problem with black squares and people sharing videos, and then maybe after that they go back to their lives. I think that's part of it. That's part of building up a sentiment that eventually will tip over into change. And we fundamentally need to rethink what we want and the tools that we are using, because they don't match, in my opinion.
It's just amazing. I want to thank you both, because I have absolutely enjoyed this discussion. If it was just me, it could continue for 3 hours, but I'm conscious that there are some questions in the audience, and there's quite a few. So I will try and take them going back up in the feed. Just give me 1 second. I'll start having a look. There's one that says to you, Apeike. So the question says, do you think the BLM movement would have been this big if George Floyd was murdered in Britain, or even worse, Tanzania? This movement looks like social engineering to me. What are your thoughts? And thank you for your question, Adrian.
Well, I think we have to obviously accept that the African-American experience is, it's almost suzerain, it's the suzerain experience within the Black experience. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Firstly, America is the biggest cultural actor on the world stage now. We are in the age of their cultural consciousness, and there's, it's not just African-American culture that is exported widely. It's just American culture, American ways of doing things. So absolutely, whatever happens there is of interest, because that is the most powerful nation, apparently, on the planet at the moment. I think also, as well, there has been, I wouldn't say an obsession, but really, since there are a lot of charismatic people came out of the civil rights movement. And I think the combination of Martin Luther King plus the anti-apartheid movement, Mandela, added to Gandhi with the Indian movement, these trifecta of pacifists came out. But within the Black experience, you have Martin Luther King and Mandela come out, and they actually get appropriated by white consciousness. They are the palatable Blacks, essentially. And so when we look at the African-American experience, everyone is still intoxicated by that dream that Martin Luther King had one day. And in the case of South Africa, everyone is intoxicated by the, what people might say is, was the capacity of Mandela to forgive or to engage in reconciliation and that sort of stuff. And those two figures, you would increasingly see, especially in South Africa, an increasing willingness to speak against the position of those individuals in public consciousness as often as almost being heroes that were given back, that were taken from the Black community, processed, and given back to the Black community. When we look at the African American experience, it's also a function of the charismatic leadership that came out and the usurpation of the figures or some of those figures and their elevation by force to represent global Blackness. So that's why we want to see whether or not America is going to achieve this task that this great man set for itself, and also with South Africa as well.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for this response. I hope that it helped you, Adrian. And I will move on to the next question. I have seen something around the diaspora, so I'm going to take this one because I wanted this point to also be mentioned in the discussion. And I want to talk about basically the 6th region. So we've said that one of the additions of the African Union, when it was kind of rebranded, was that it included the 6th region and the diaspora. So for those who may not be familiar with the concept, I think the African diaspora is estimated at 170 million, and the vast majority of them are living in Latin America. So as much as when we like subconsciously refer to diaspora, we always think of the Americas and Europe primarily, but the actual bulk and majority of that African diaspora is in Latin America, and like by way far. Like I think then it's North America, and then after that it's Europe. So that's also interesting to take into account before you respond to those questions. And there's a question from Lindsay that says, what do you think of the role of the diaspora in the development of Africa? The repat movement is rising, but are we more useful here or there? So who wants to take that one? Maybe Professor Hakim?
Well, the question is, what is development? What does development mean? People, not just recently, but for many years, since the 19th century, even before, people return to Africa. Some people return their money. Well, maybe we all return our money in one way or another because we all have families and so on. But the question of development is a little bit different, because what development is about not just people surviving or economies growing or GDP, but development has to be seen in the kind of ways I think I've talked about tonight. That is, who makes the decisions, who is at the center of the economy, who does the economy benefit, these kind of questions. So those are, if you like, political questions, and the contribution which people can make to those issues, it doesn't really matter whether we are here, there, or wherever, because the political struggles, if you're in Africa, then you have to struggle in Africa. If you're in the diaspora, then you have to struggle in the diaspora. It's not one or the other. Particularly in Britain, where we're in a country where there is a government and they're the big multinationals that interfere in African affairs, exploit people in Africa, dominate the economies and other aspects of societies in Africa. So you could say the question would then be, well, how can those things be stopped? Can they only be stopped by people acting in Africa, or can they also be stopped by people acting in Britain, or acting in the US, or acting in Canada or Germany? And obviously, if the political situation changed here or in other countries of that kind, then that would also be a contribution to changing things in Africa. So I think that people need to be involved in changing things, involved in empowering themselves, involved in developing an alternative to what currently exists wherever we may find ourselves. I don't think development is just a question of should I work here or should I work in Africa. That to me doesn't mean anything very much. It's more about what else do you do and what other contribution do you make, I would think.
Thank you so much. Apeike, I would also like to hear your thoughts on this question of development and what potentially us in the diaspora can bring to the continent.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to differentiate in the diaspora between the old diaspora and the new diaspora. So, of course, I think that there are people who are in diaspora who don't have living live connections to Africa. And so this conversation would be moot in terms of whether or not they have an investment in anything in Africa. So, and then even the intentions of those people who are in diaspora, what are their long-term intentions? Are they here to immerse themselves into a new consciousness, into a new culture, which is to become a hyphenated person? So a Black British person, a Black French person, and a new African American person, or a Nigerian American, or Ghanaian.
And you guys are even allowed to say in France, it's not really as obvious unless you have like double nationality, but it's not necessarily all the countries as well that allow it. But it's kind of you get special treatment.
Yeah. So I think that's important, right? So there are multiplicities within the diaspora in itself. So we can't take even the diaspora as being a monolith. We have to break it down. And in that case, if we're looking into history, we have to think about what has been the nature of people who have gone back. And it's not probably a great record if we look at mass returns to the continent. And look at the early settlers in Sierra Leone. Most of their settlements fell, but they were not trying to integrate with the people there. And they came and brought some of their thoughts and ideas about Africa back with them. And that was a problem. Then if we look at the most successful, which was Liberia in terms of surviving, we can see that those divisions in society continue to exist till this day, very much so. And that wouldn't be necessarily a great example of a return. And then there have been various chambers of commerce that have been set up by African Americans, by various iterations of Caribbean Americans, Black Caribbeans, Afro-Caribbeans on the continent that have had varying degrees of success, but have none of which have sought to actually engage with African people, but have all sought to bring capital from elsewhere and live as the colonialists did in little enclaves away from the people, and develop economic systems that were inherently exploitative. So there's not a great history. And even when you hear a lot of people if we talk of like myself, or maybe if I extend it also to you, Marcy, who are maybe in the new diaspora, who are very much of Europe, but have connections back to Africa, maybe not necessarily going there as much, but still connections in our identity.
Yeah.
The language that is used is extremely exploitative. People talk about wanting to go, I'm from Nigeria, so people talk about wanting to go back to Nigeria, but they don't want to live like a Nigerian.
Yes.
Right? I can't go back to Nigeria unless I have this amount of money and I can have this type of lifestyle.
And can be in Lekki and so on. Yeah.
Right? And it's like, okay, you want to go back, but you don't want to live. You don't actually want to engage.
You want Wi-Fi all the way through. You want, unlimited data, driver, Uber.
And this reminds me of, Fanon spoke about, when you have people who enter into the intellectual classes and then they want to go back and lead the people, and how they will never be able to lead the people. It's not possible. There's a disconnection. They will never understand, and they will always look upon the people, or they will always be seen as foreigners, because your foreignness is not in your passport, it's in your spirit, right? It's in your consciousness, and how you communicate, the language you use, even. Half these people wanting to go back don't speak the language. So I think that there has to be, I think people going back can cause more problems than they think that they're solving, and can transfer some problems from this place over there. And if we are going to go back, I think that we need to begin to have concrete conversations about how we do that in a way that's going to be empowering to people who are still there, which isn't going to transfer the things we're trying to escape here. We don't want to transfer it there, because then what would be the point?
I think you absolutely answered the question, because I can see I could not agree more. What is the point of going back if not to make an impact and contribute improving the condition of people living there, wealth, health, basic needs being filled, and so on. So thank you for this great question, Lindsay, and I'm happy that it covered what you needed to hear. I'm going to move on to the next question that I have seen earlier. I think it was to Professor Hakim, something about the AU. Let me just find it. Yes, so here it is. Keep sending your questions through. I can see them, and we'll try and clear as many as possible. So yes, here is the
In
question.
the next 10 minutes, I have to leave at 9.
Yes, so that's why this question is for you, and then we should be in a good position to take a couple more and then close out. So to me, the AU is slowing down Africa's development on purpose as they operate in collusion with Western powerhouses. In this context, how could we concretely and truly liberate our continent?
Well, it's a big question to answer, but I mean, the AU is a reflection of what exists in Africa at the moment. That is to say, the current governments of African countries. So I suppose the question is, to what extent do the governments of African countries represent the interests of the people of those countries? And you might conclude that, well, not very much. So if, as individual governments, they don't represent the interests of the majority of people in their countries, then as a continental organization, they're unlikely to be able to represent the interests of the majority of people on the continent. So the question then is, okay, how can the majority of people empower themselves so that they constitute the governments of African countries? That's a very big question. If we had the solution to it, then we wouldn't be sitting here. We'd be somewhere else. But I think the key thing is that it's a question of people struggling with that perspective, of empowering themselves, of becoming the decision makers, of getting rid of these imposed political institutions which come from somewhere else, which no person in Africa has ever, generally speaking, has ever had any contribution to deciding whether they should be adopted or not. So we need political systems which satisfy the needs and requirements of people in the continent, just as we need economies which are people-centered, which satisfy the needs of people for the essential things which they all need. So I think that is the struggle. That's the question that lies ahead of people. The difficulty is how to bring that about, and it is basically a question of people continuing to develop different forms of struggle, whatever they may be, against the existing politics, existing political institutions, against the existing economic institutions, and trying to develop new institutions and empower themselves. In each country, it's going to be a little bit different, but I think that is the orientation. And if you like, not thinking that voting for another government is going to make a difference, or not thinking that anything which maintains things as they are is really going to solve the problem. It's really looking for an alternative to what currently exists. That's the challenge, and then finding the ways of bringing it about. And that means, continuing, as I say, continuing to struggle, to organize, to discuss, to think, to not be satisfied with what is. So that is I would say that's the simple way of putting it. But doing it is struggle.
Yeah.
It's not something that's stable. Just as in Britain or in the US or in other places, that's what people strive for, to end all these things that we protest about or complain about? Why should we have to keep complaining and protesting? Why can't we be the decision makers on all these things?
Yeah.
But bringing that about is, is not so straightforward. So when it is done, as we said in Saint-Domingue, we have to take a moment to give our respect to those who managed to bring it about.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this response. And maybe you can, if you could just wrap up your point, maybe with this point that has been raised about alternatives. Are workers' cooperative the way forward economically for Africa? It is evident Western capitalism isn't working. That's a question from Mr. T, and thank you.
Well, again, it depends what we mean by cooperatives, because cooperatives also exist under the capital-centered system. You know, they are a way of operating within that system. So, of themselves, having a cooperative or organizing a cooperative doesn't necessarily resolve the problem. It might mitigate some of the consequences, possibly, or it might be a kind of building block to something else. But of itself, it doesn't solve the problem, which is the kind of economic system at large. So it's really thinking about a new kind of society, which is not capital-centered, or to put it another way, a kind of economy which isn't based on making the rich richer.
Yeah.
Because that's what a capital-centered economy essentially is. It means the rich, it's based around paying the rich and making the rich richer.
Yeah.
So that all the wealth is produced goes to the rich. So you want an economy where those who produce all the wealth also decide what happens to that wealth, and use it for the benefit of the majority. That's essentially what is required. And then you have an economy which is planned in the interests and for the needs of the majority, which has a health system, an education system, an economic system, which is and such economies are possible and even exist. And we can compare them to, what we have here. They may not be perfect, but they're definitely different. Just to give one example, if you look at economy like the Cuban economy, which is not in Africa, it's in America or in the American continent, but it's developed in a different way, and it's essentially people-centered. Okay, it's being blockaded by the US for 60 years, so it has various problems, but it's still people-centered. And I had an example this week. I was talking to somebody, and she said, I'm just going for my jab. So she went for her COVID jab. She said, well, I can't have the jab because I've got high blood pressure. So I said, well, how do you know? He said, well, they tested you before you had the jab. You had to have your blood pressure taken. I said, what? I said, well, they don't do that here. So then I said, well, what happened next? She said, well, the doctor checked my blood pressure every day afterwards. And when my blood pressure went down to the required level and after various other things, then I could have the jab. So that is a health system which is people-centered. It looks after it says, okay, the people come first, their health comes first, we will look after them. And so that's just a simple example. There are others. Yeah. But it's different from the system here, which you could say that even the COVID jab is kind of developed in the interest of the big pharmaceutical companies and who knows what else. And it probably has all kinds of effects that we don't even know about yet. And so, anyway, it's a different way of doing things. And as we've heard in the last few days, the whole ways in which the pandemic has been run by the government it doesn't have the interests of the people at the center of it. It has other interests. How are we going to keep the economy going? How are we going to keep the big monopolies making profits? All sorts of other things. So these are two different types of running an economy. And in Africa, unfortunately, we have you could say the British style of economy, which is based on making the rich richer. And the rich do get richer. But we want a different kind, which is about the people being well and so on and so on. So those are the kinds of issues that confront most parts of the world. These things are possible to change. We know they're possible to change. There are alternatives to the way things are done now, but we don't yet have them in place, and that's what needs to be put in place.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for this great question, Mr. T. And I think it was it Afromoya's team? Can't remember who raised that question earlier. But thank you both for this question. And thank you for answering as well, Professor Hakim. I know that you have to run away and leave us. Unfortunately, I wish I could ask you questions until very late in the evening, but thank you
you
so
can invite me back again and ask me other questions.
Oh, thank you so much. I like that. Like, you know, immediate feedback, like you would like to come back again. And in the comment section, if you would like to have another session with Professor Hakim, who knows a lot, let us know as well in the comments so we can see. And maybe even as things reopen, why not have even a live event where it's actually a physical event where we can have you over and you can come and share with us some of your knowledge. So yeah, again, thank you so much. For those who joined us halfway through, I'm just going to put back the slide for Professor Hakim. So if you don't know who he is, this is just a very, very small snippet of what he's involved in. So he is professor of, I think I had the banner for you guys. You've seen it earlier. He's professor of the history of Africa and the African diaspora of the University of Chichester. But on top of that, he's also one of the founding members of the Young Historians Project, which supports young people between 16 and 25 to have a creative project and initiatives around history. And he's also the author of many books, one of which I'm quite happy to have, and that I would recommend you is the first one, Pan-Africanism and History. And I'm really happy that he was able to join us tonight. As I know that his schedule is very busy. We've lost Professor Hakim Adi, so I'll remove him from now. I'm not sure if he will be back, but thank you so much to him. And we will continue with Apeike on the next questions that have been raised and that are also interesting. So if you can help us clear out some of them. I've seen one around integration. Hello, Afromoya team. Nice to have you in the chat. What are your thoughts on the struggles for racial equality and integration in Western society? You're on mute, so I can't hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh wow, this is interesting. We were actually talking about this, weren't we?
Yes.
On the difference between multiculturalism and assimilationism, and the francophone and anglophone experience under colonialism. I'll start with the first thing, racial equality. So when we think about equality, it means that everybody should be treated the same, right? So equality says that if we both apply for a job, then we should both have an equal chance to get the job. If we both want to live in a particular house, we should both have the same chance to live in the house, or basically nobody should be able to deny us the chance to do that because of our race. And I think that in terms of getting racial equality, that has to be preceded by racial recalibration, because you cannot ignore the last 500 years of denigration and now ask for racial equality. Because if Black people or African people got racial equality today, we would be behind and we would stay behind, right? So if, for example, there are already one, let's say in every 10 families in Western societies, even if let's allow for the size differences. Let's say there were 5 white families and 5 Black families, just to make things easier. And if there were 4 of those families in the white community that would be wealthy, and in the Black community there's just 1, then racial equality means that we'll just remain, we'll just stay the same, and maybe nothing will change. But how do we fix that? We have to fix that first. So I'm a proponent for looking at racial equity, and actually in making decisions about what needs to be done, we take into account the existing racial disparities and make decisions based on that point. And then there is also the idea that why is equality all that we want, right? This is again using the wrong tools for the outcome that you want. So we talk about getting to a position that's equivalent to white societies, but white societies does not get there by being fair.
Yeah.
Or being equal, right? The supremacy that we see in white societies is a function of a lot of exploitation. So you cannot talk about racial equality bringing any kind of prosperity, because racial equality did not bring the prosperity of white people. It was exploitation that brought the white culture and white societies to rise and dominate the way that they did. So in terms of racial equality, I'm not sure that that concept is something I would agree with, because I have particular views about where my society and where my community should be. And I believe that we should be wherever we are best, or if we are best for something, that's where we should be, essentially. And if that means that we are everywhere, then we're everywhere, right? If we're always the best at something, I take that, right? In terms of integration into Western societies, again, I would say, I would have to break that down into different levels, because integration presupposes that there's a particular way of living that already exists in the West. We're coming in and we have particular ways of living, and we need to chip and chop bits of ourselves to fit into the grooves of the way Western societies live. And that's counterintuitive to what we're really trying to achieve. So I think what I would want instead is to be able to live in peace in Western societies, and not just in physical peace, but also in psychological peace as well. I don't want my cultures, my language to be denigrated. So that, for me, not necessarily integration, maybe that might be a future step, but first, just to be able to live in peace would be the first thing for me.
Thank you so much for this response. And I'll just add to follow up on that, because I know that you're working on your book as well around Black consciousness. And I would just like to can you just share with us, if you can, a very brief and basic definition of what Black consciousness means, as we've just started touching on mental health and being spiritually balanced, being at peace, and so on.
So Black consciousness has multiple layers, and it's actually almost a process that you go through, and it's a state of being. This is my theory, that Black consciousness is a state of being. You don't arrive at it. It's not a destination that you arrive at. You live within it. And the first stage in Black consciousness for me is firstly to gain an understanding of all of the ways in which this society has been structured on racial terms, and how it has been structured in order to denigrate one particular race and to elevate another particular race. And in different countries, that will manifest in different ways. So that's the first thing we need to do. So understand that things from language, for example, we'll start with language, what we value in society. Even last year, we had a conversation about the Black feminine, and how when you look at the definition of feminine in the dictionary, it talks about weakness and about being weak. But this is a very Western definition of femininity. Of course, in the African tradition, there is no concept that women are physically weak. This doesn't exist, because women are fathers and carrying things on their heads and all of this. So this idea doesn't exist. So even that in itself is a form of cultural supremacy, because even the dictionary is written from one person's point of view. So that's the first step. You map your environment and you understand that everything in your environment is a function of the racialization of public and private space. After you've done that, then you must make the decision that you're going to begin to reverse those things within yourself psychologically. And there are various ways that you can do that. So you can do that using historical methods. So to go back into your history and begin to see alternative ways of doing things that discount the prevailing status quo. You can begin to use positive psychology. So that's what I was talking about before, where you actually present images of positivity to yourself. You can begin to take action as well in terms of how you exist in the world, how you use space, how you talk. And all of those things are all to try to get you back to your humanity, because Black consciousness is about returning you to a state of humanity where you no longer see yourself as a function of your race. You see yourself as a human where all of your cultural and historic attributes are valuable. So yeah, I know it's not a short one, but
I did that purposely because I knew you would give us the long one anyway. But I fully appreciate this definition, and I think and that's why I also really appreciate when you have lectures, is because we really have the time on a particular topic to go in depth. So for those of you guys who do not know who Apeike is and what our organization is, again, I highly invite you to go check out the links that are appearing on the screen below. And I'll also quickly pop up the presentation again so you can see a bit of the environment and universe in which she will take you in. So she has this incredible platform where she offers lectures, workshops, and she also now has the African Review, where you can read very interesting articles on very specific points. So do not accept, your usual, what is BLM? Where does it come from? What is Africa Day? Where does it come from? Not those type of articles, but very specific points on, for example, the Negritude movement, or on Frantz Fanon's positions at a particular point in his life, or on Steve Biko. I've really appreciated the lecture we had on the trial of Steve Biko. That was absolutely incredible to sometimes go through historical records of his trial, and to try and see how it was just so hilarious that they were trying to prove him wrong, that it only gives us more tools for us to reflect on and to see how powerful he was. And it's just those kind of discussions. So if you're some of those who like to go a bit further than just the surface layer and the usual Nelson Mandela's and Martin Luther King discussions and so on, that is definitely a place I would invite you to look at. Before we close out the discussion, I'll just ask Apeike again to share with us what's a next step, where we can find you and so on.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, please, whatever social media platform you're on, find us on there. So Instagram is sort of our main hub, and that's just at African History Project. But we also have a great presence on Facebook, and we are Africa X History, and that's a great place to get the links to those articles that Marcy was mentioning. We're also on LinkedIn as well. So, and we're just African History Project on there. So please follow us there. And the great thing about that is we announce all of our fellowship positions and our researcher positions. And we have principal researcher positions where you don't need any prior experience whatsoever. So you just have to look out for those. And at the moment, we've just welcomed 3 principal researchers who have begun working on our first podcast, which is going to be about the First Republic in Nigeria and the fall of the First Republic in Nigeria. So we're going to try and look at all of the republics. So eventually we're going to cover every country. So look out for those. In terms of, if you want to then actually commit some time, our next lecture is going to be at the beginning of June, and it's going to be an introduction to African religions. And we are taking it from a philosophy of history, philosophy of religion's point of view, and a cosmological point of view, as well as looking at the practicalities of how African religions were actually practiced or continue to be practiced, because they're very much still alive. So that's, I would definitely love you to join us on that. And then in July, we're going to be having a lecture on the looting of Africa's artifacts. And this is actually not going to be
topic.
Yeah. It's not even going to be about the 20th or 21st century. We're going to look at the 2 principal wars. So the Ashanti British War of the 1870s and the sacking of Benin in the 1890s. And we're going to look at what actually happened. Why did those conflicts escalate? Why did the leaders choose to abandon the cities? And why were those things taken? And also, why does the taking of those artifacts mean something in the context of how people have since spoken about African cultures, which has been devoid of culture or devoid of history? But you are stealing thousands of items and exhibiting them
in your museums, private collections,
right? While in your universities, you're teaching that the same people have no history. So we're going to, be having that conversation about the depth of denigration that takes place there. Then, if you're really super interested, you can begin to join us to do some practical work. So actually begin to learn. We have workshops. We have 2 workshops that are running. One's on writing. So if you're into writing, we do a literature workshop where we take all of those works that Marcy was just mentioning, and we use them to teach ourselves aspects of how to be good writers and thinkers. And then we have also one called the Black Consciousness Workshop, which actually teaches you how all those things I mentioned, mapping and everything, teaches you how to do that. And we also have short courses and a foundation certificate as well. So if you want something structured where you have assignments, tutorials, we have a wonderful community of fellows, lecturers who will guide you through that. It's very high quality. And we've just launched the African Review, which we hope is going to, really grow to be this great hub of cultural content, academic essays, but also we are going to launch a poetry directory as well, where we begin to republish all of those lost poems, particularly from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So a lot to get involved in. Please get in touch with us if you have any questions. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for this great presentation. And it's actually after listening to one of your lectures last year that I was one of those people who got in touch. Yes. And now here you are, you accepted to come on the talk show. I'm very pleased that you took the time to stay with us for such a long and very interesting.
Well, I have to. This doesn't even come close to what I made you do. But she held on for more than 2 hours. I mean, it must have been 2 hours.
I think we lasted for like 3 hours, but I came on, I think after 2 hours, definitely. But we were still on for like another hour and a half after.
Yeah. So this is commitment.
No, that was absolutely great. And I really appreciate all your insight and the way the content is presented. And I can testify because I've attended several myself. It is not going to be the usual, I already know what's going to come on the next slide. No, there's always a twist, and there's always something that you take out from each of the discussions or from the comments section. So really, really, I highly appreciate this project, and I will definitely keep supporting them. As far as I am concerned, if you guys want to know more about us, if you've appreciated what you've just watched, I would highly appreciate that you subscribe to the YouTube page, that you share the live, which is, freely available for anyone to catch up if you were not able to be with us tonight. I would also like to thank everyone in the comments section who made it very lively and raised incredibly insightful and interesting questions. Afro Moya, Adrian, Lindsay, I've seen Mr. T. So all of your questions were very, very insightful in the chat, and I appreciate you being with us tonight, as well as all those who were quiet and maybe shy to raise theirs, because you've also made part of this great discussion. Again, I will thank as well Professor Hakim, who've left us, but he was absolutely incredible, as you guys have seen yourself. And I would also encourage you to check out his website, his social media pages, so that you can get more of a depth of who he is, because he is really, really a true ground-based activist. Like I spoke to him before offline and so on, and he really, really knows what he's talking about. So if you're looking for any type of content relating to like kind of maybe historical stuff from Britain as well and so on, he's absolutely a great resource. So again, I'm not going to take much of your evenings. Thank you so much for staying online with us on a Thursday evening. But unless you guys have any closing remarks, we should be done. I can't see anything in the comment section. Oh, thanks. Oh, thank you for staying on, and thank you for your questions as well and comments. Thank you so much. Happy that you guys have taken something away from this. I think that was the point, to keep the discussion going and to just keep sharing and highlighting people in the diaspora who do amazing things and need to be supported by all of us. So, Apeike, I'm not going to take much of your time, so I'm going to let you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I really, really look forward to seeing you in real life as soon as possible.
Oh, don't worry. I'll be there. I'll be the first person on your first event. Don't worry. I'll come into, I never come into London, but I will come into London.
I appreciate that. Absolutely appreciate that. All right. I'll let you go. Thank
Okay,
you so
take
much.
care. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. And for everybody, well, you guys know who I am already. I'm Marcy, the founder of Lisanga Vibes. If you want to connect with me personally and so on, I'm quite accessible on social media. You can email me as well. A lot of good stuff is coming out for the project this year. So I highly encourage you to stay in touch with us because there will be a lot coming out very soon. And I'm not going to take much more time of your evening that I have already done, but I hope that you guys are all doing well, appreciated this. And I thank you again for watching this up until the end. All right, without further ado, I'm going to say bye and see you to the next one, which will be planned not so long ago from not so long away from now. We're going to have another Crispy Talk Show on a different topic in June. So please stay in touch because we will be sharing more details about that. All right. I wish you all a great evening and I see you very, very, very soon.